A little bit of background about the project and what exactly we're up to. We're in the middle of it, so I'm not going to be giving you any final results just yet. And then I'm going to give you a sneak preview of some selected preliminary findings and a little bit of teasers about some forthcoming stuff we'll be doing and some analyses. So I have to admit to you, I am new to motorcycle safety, and I think we all know, or most of y'all in this room are keenly aware of why safety is an issue for motorcycles. But I think we have some work to do when it comes to educating non-riders like myself about the differences between motorcycles and cars. Motorcycles are less stable because you're on two wheels rather than four, you're exposed, and also you're harder to see. And I think a lot of non-riders don't think about these things enough. Let's see. We've already talked a lot about this, so I won't obsess about it much more, but we're also interested in motorcycles. At the national level, you're about 5 times as likely as a passenger vehicle to experience some sort of injury if you're in a crash, and about 26 times as likely to experience a fatality. Here in Texas, of crashes, about 87% result in some sort of injury or fatality. And as DJ's already mentioned, the number of registrations has increased dramatically over the last 15 years. In 2000, we were at about 200,000 registrations, and currently we're in the 400,000 registration range, which is just amazing. Okay, so the project, what are we trying to do? We're really trying to understand the complexity of crashes so that we can prioritize, not just understand what increases crash risk, but prioritize points for intervention and the implementation of countermeasures. And ultimately, this is to prevent death and injury, and this is a high priority issue for TxDOT. So this graph here, it's kind of hard to see, it's a little bit small, but we're looking at the number of incapacitating and fatal crashes by rural status. So you can see over time, we're fairly consistent with some decreases more recently in the number of incapacitating injuries and fatalities. And when you break that down by rural and urban status, overall we have more crashes in urban areas than rural areas. That's not to say that rural areas are less risky. It's just that more vehicle miles are being driven in urban areas. So when you look at the graph on the left-hand side are the number of registrations over years. We've seen a little bit of a decrease, 2013, 2014, 2015. I think that's more likely a reflection of possibly the gas prices falling and more people driving bigger vehicles with the lower gas prices. But as DJ alluded to, the rate of fatal and incapacitating injuries per number of motorcycle registrations is decreasing slowly over time. So we're currently at about 5 fatal or incapacitating injuries per 1,000 registrations. So we are having some kind of possible impact here. In terms of operators versus passengers, for every 9 operators that are killed or incapacitated, there's 1 passenger similarly injured. And that's largely a reflection of the fact that a lot more operators are on motorcycles than passengers. So when we break down the information by age, you're looking at all crash severities for last year, 2015. The largest proportion of those, or 26%, are occurring with folks in the 21 to 29 year age range. And then it decreases, the proportion decreases with age. And I think this is likely a reflection of the fact that there are simply more riders in that 21 to 29 year age group. And I think most of y'all realize you're riding in the times of year that are nicer, the weather's nicer. So we do see upticks in the April, May time of year, and then again in the September, October, November time of year, when here in Texas the weather's a lot nicer, it's cooler. So helmet use and age. If we look at all the crashes occurring among folks that are not wearing a helmet, there's not much of a difference in terms of age. Age is pretty much evenly distributed. But one interesting thing was when you look at the crashes occurring amongst folks that are wearing their helmet, we see a larger proportion of younger riders wearing their helmet. And I think this is a reflection of the fact that these younger folks are the ones growing up with the safety messages, the increased safety messaging that's been happening nationally as well as in Texas. So I think that's a really good sign. When we look at helmet use by severity of the crash, we do see that among fatalities, helmet use, about half of those folks are not wearing a helmet. And the proportion of not wearing a helmet decreases as injury severity decreases. So among those with no injury, the proportion of not wearing a helmet was around 32%. And so we're doing a lot, these are just preliminary results, so we're doing a lot more complicated analysis to try and understand helmet use a little bit better. And so one of the most striking results that I found so far was pertaining to alcohol use. So this graph here presents the percent of operators who died by manner of collision and alcohol result. So the tallest bar there is for crashes that occurred where two vehicles were in opposite directions. Of those vehicles, if there was a positive alcohol, of those crashes, if the motorcyclist had a positive alcohol result, 76% of those were killed.
Just to clarify,
yeah.
76%, that's the motorcyclist rate?
So to compare, only 9% of the folks without a positive alcohol result were killed. So I'm really curious. I'm really, really interested in this result and trying to understand better how alcohol interacts with other variables to increase crash risk. So for angle crashes, 63% of folks that had a positive alcohol result were killed, compared to only 5% of the ones that were not drinking. For same direction crashes, 55% of those that were drinking alcohol were killed, compared to only 3% of those who were not drinking. And for single vehicle crashes, 45% of those folks were killed, compared to only 4% of the ones who were not drinking. So when we think about alcohol consumption and helmet use, of folks that did not have a negative alcohol, that did have a negative alcohol test result, it's a mouthful, half of those folks were wearing a helmet. But when there was a positive alcohol result, only about 27% of those folks were wearing a helmet. We're doing a lot of work trying to understand the M-class endorsement and its effect on crash risk, as well as training and how recently the training occurred, and also the level of training, the degree of training that the person had. So we're working with DPS to get that data. As you can see here, more than 40% of folks involved in crashes, regardless of the crash severity, had no M-class endorsement last year in 2015. And then this graph here is showing over time the proportion of fatally injured operators who didn't have their M-class endorsement. It was hovering around 40% for the last few years, but then last year we saw an uptick increase to 47% in 2015. So 47% of those fatally injured did not have their M-class endorsement. And we think about at fault, we've gone through a lot of detail to go through the crash records to look at the narratives, to try and understand which was the motorcycle at fault or the other vehicle. So here, the numbers didn't come through, but it's about 3/4 of the motorcycle fatalities, the motorcycle was at fault, and about 1/4 the car or other vehicle was at fault. But of interest, for the cars at fault, about 28% of them failed to yield the right-of-way to the motorcycle. And this often occurred while the motorcycle was turning left. So this is for only motorcycle fatalities. We're going to be looking at all the other crash severities. We're looking at pulling the VIN numbers for the motorcycles that were involved in crashes and going and looking at identifying their engine size and other characteristics of the motorcycle. And so for some reason, all my numbers didn't come through. So anyway, of operator fatalities, about half of those are occurring in cruisers and about half in sport bikes. Of the ones that are occurring in sport bikes, about the engine size is about half of them are about in the 1,000 to 1,499 cc, and about the other half is around a little bit smaller of an engine size, 500 to 999 cc's. The cruisers overall have a bit larger engine size. I think it's just a function of the fact that cruisers are bigger overall. About half had an engine size of about 1,500 cc's and a half in the 1,000 to 1,500 cc range. So next, these are just fatalities. We're going to be looking to see if the size of the engine has any impact on crash severity. Next, we are looking at road geometry, specifically curves, and how that plays a role in crashes with motorcycles. Here we're looking at normal curve involvement by crash severity for just the motorcycle having a crash, single vehicle on system roads for 2015. So about 36% of fatalities happened on a normal curve. So it's a bit higher than all the other crash severities, which were hovering around 20 to 25%. So now we're curious, what is it about these curves and the geometry of them? How steep are they, and are there other engineering controls that could be added to make curves safer? So this graph is showing over time the fatal motorcycle crashes with normal curve involvement, and we saw an increase. It may be increasing to over time. So we're also curious about why that may be happening. So we're looking more into that with files like Rhino files and GeoHine files. So in closing, we're going to be looking at all the issues that I've just discussed much more closely, looking at the interaction of different variables, and the analysis will be forthcoming in September of 2016.